When the Allied forces began liberating the concentration camps in 1945, what they discovered exceeded any horror imaginable. Piles of corpses, emaciated prisoners, and souls shattered by years of torment. For the Jews who survived the Holocaust, liberation did not immediately mean freedom, but rather the start of a new era marked by uncertainty. Many were ill, without family, without a homeland, and with nowhere to return. After the war, over 250,000 Jewish survivors were placed in displaced persons camps across Germany, Austria, and Italy. There, under Allied supervision, they slowly began to reconstruct their lives. Some hoped to emigrate to America or Palestine, while others attempted to start new families. Among the few who remained, many joined Zionist organizations or collaborated with underground networks to flee the continent. The catastrophe, the final solution, exterminated 6 million Jews. During World War II, the Third Reich's machinery advanced not only with tanks and planes across Europe, but also with a relentless, systematic ideology aimed at the complete annihilation of an entire people. The Holocaust, or Shoah, was not an improvised act of hatred. It was a meticulously planned state policy carried out with chilling precision. Between 1941 and 1945, nearly 6 million European Jews were murdered by the Nazi regime in an operation that blurred the boundaries between humanity and inhumanity. Nazi anti-Semitism had roots long before the outbreak of war. Since Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the German National Socialist Party promoted virulent rhetoric against Jews, blaming them for Germany's hardships from defeat in World War I, the economic crisis that struck the Weimar Republic. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 codified this discrimination. Jews were stripped of German citizenship, civil rights, and societal standing, rendering them legal pariahs. With the invasion of Poland in 1939, Nazi anti-Semitic policies became brutally systematic. Conquered territories were home to millions of Jews, particularly in Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, whose communities were ancient, numerous, and culturally vibrant. The Nazis viewed them as a threat that had to be eradicated. Initially, Jews were confined to ghettos, overcrowded, walled-off neighborhoods with horrific sanitary and nutritional conditions. The Warsaw Ghetto, one of the largest, eventually contained over 400,000 people in a few square kilometers. Hunger, disease, and SS brutality became routine. This phase, however, was only the beginning. In 1941, with the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a new stage of mass murder commenced. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units executed thousands in forests, fields, and villages. Men, women, children, and the elderly were lined up next to mass graves and shot. In Babin Yar, Ukraine, over 33,000 Jews were killed in just 2 days. Even this method was deemed inefficient by Nazi leaders, leading to the formulation of the so-called Final Solution. In January 1942, at the Wannsee Conference near Berlin, senior Third Reich officials met to coordinate the systematic extermination of Europe's Jewish population. Deportation and segregation were no longer sufficient. It was now a matter of total annihilation. Extermination camps were constructed: Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, and Chelmno. Unlike concentration camps used for forced labor or political prisoners, these camps had a single purpose: death. They were industrialized killing centers. Deportees arrived in cattle cars after days without food or water. Upon arrival, Nazi doctors conducted selections, separating those fit for labor from those condemned to die. Most were sent immediately to gas chambers. At Auschwitz, the deadliest camp, the use of Zyklon B, a lethal pesticide repurposed as a genocidal weapon, was perfected. Thousands were incinerated daily in industrial crematoria. Smoke rising from the chimneys became the most horrific symbol of the Holocaust. At its peak, Auschwitz could exterminate up to 10,000 people per day. Nazi cruelty extended beyond murder to systematic dehumanization. Jews were shaved, stripped of clothing and belongings, and tattooed with numbers, reducing identity to a mere code. Entire families were destroyed. Medical experiments were inflicted on living victims. Cultural symbols of Judaism, synagogues, books, cemeteries were obliterated. Victims often had no graves, vanishing into smoke, train cars, and mass graves across Eastern Europe. The administrative coldness of the Nazi regime turned genocide into a bureaucratic machine of annihilation. As the Allies advanced and the Reich's defeat neared, the Nazis intensified efforts to erase evidence of their crimes. Crematoria were destroyed, prisoners forced to exhume and burn bodies, and camps dismantled. But it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. The Holocaust was not only the systematic murder of 6 million people, it was an attempt to obliterate an entire culture, religion, and history. It marked the failure of European civilization, which, through action or inaction, allowed such horror to occur. Even more poignant were the survivors, those who escaped death by chance, resistance, or intervention. Men, women, and children who saw their families perish, who lived among corpses and endured inhuman conditions, carried the memory of this horror. They became witnesses the world could not ignore. Yet for many, the fall of the Third Reich did not end their ordeal. Liberation did not equate to immediate freedom. It marked the start of a struggle for dignity, justice, and the possibility of rebuilding a life amid the ruins. The liberation of Nazi concentration camps in the winter of 1945 exposed the world to unprecedented horror. Soviet troops first liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945. Discovering ghostly barracks, mounds of corpses, partially destroyed crematoria, and around 7,000 prisoners abandoned during the Nazi evacuation. Many of them were on the verge of death from malnutrition, disease, or freezing. They didn't know if they were alive or dead. They didn't know if the horror was over or simply changing. Shortly after the British liberated Bergen-Belsen, the Americans arrived at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mount, and the French at Nutva, Strudo. In each of these camps, the same image was repeated. Human beings reduced to living skeletons, survivors barely able to stand, nameless children, women with blank stares, men unable to comprehend that the horror had come to an end. The liberating soldiers, even though they were men hardened by years of war, were unprepared for what they saw. Some vomited, others cried. But many also took photographs, unable to believe that what they saw before them was not a nightmare. Images from the liberated camps began to circulate in the international press and reached movie screens in the Allied countries. Humanity then discovered with horror the true meaning of the word genocide. The reactions were immediate and multiple. On the one hand, it was a profound moral shock. On the other, it was a political and diplomatic bewilderment. How had it been possible for such a crime to have been carried out in broad daylight for years without the world's powers preventing it? The question didn't find an easy answer. The first photographs and films began to circulate in the days and weeks following the liberation of the camps. British and American newsreels included segments showing images captured in Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Bonwald, and Mauthausen. In movie theaters in London, New York, and Paris, viewers reacted with disbelief, horror, and often denial. It was common for some to cover their eyes, for others to walk out, or for muffled screams of horror to be heard. Humanity had no adequate telling to process this. The Holocaust shattered familiar moral frameworks. Public opinion in the Allied countries was deeply shocked. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Winston Churchill's speech was tinged with unusual harshness. In the United States, President Harry Truman authorized the creation of commissions to document the crimes and preserve the evidence. France, still reeling from the German occupation, faced its own guilt. The Vichy regime's collaboration in the deportation of French Jews to Auschwitz. The emotional impact was so strong that many began to question whether the Allies had done enough to stop the genocide. Criticism grew, especially in Jewish circles. Later documents revealed that British and American intelligence services had known, at least since 1942, of the existence of a systematic plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe. However, no direct military action was taken to disrupt this process. No bombing of the railways leading to Auschwitz. No attacks on the crematoria. No large-scale rescue operations. The discovery of the concentration camps brought with it a moral urgency. It was necessary to bring those responsible to justice, give the victims a voice, and create a legal framework that would prevent anything similar from happening again. Thus began the development of what would later be known as the Nuremberg Trials, an unprecedented legal initiative that defined crimes against humanity for the first time. The testimonies of the survivors profoundly impacted the judges, prosecutors, and audiences. These weren't just numbers. They were the stories of how prisoners were forced to dig their own graves, how mothers were separated from their children on the arrival ramp, how bodies were used as raw material to produce soap, or how gold teeth were pulled out before being cremated. The testimonies broke the silence, and they did so with devastating starkness. The church also reacted, albeit with nuances. While some religious leaders immediately condemned the Nazi horror, others opted for caution or silence. The Vatican's attitude was particularly ambiguous. While Pope Pius XII had expressed general concern for the victims of the war, he never publicly condemned the genocide of the Jews during the conflict. This omission would be a source of controversy for decades. In the academic and cultural spheres, the discovery of the Holocaust caused a profound upheaval. Intellectuals, writers, and philosophers began to ask questions about human nature, civilization, and modernity. If enlightened Germany, the homeland of Goethe and Beethoven, had been able to build a Witz, what did progress mean? Was it possible to trust human beings after that? In the following years, universities added chairs on genocide. Specialized archives were created. International symposia were organized to study anti-Semitism, Nazi propaganda, and the psychology of the perpetrators. The Holocaust became an open wound, an object of constant reflection, and also a turning point in the moral history of the 20th century. The Allied countries also began to review their own immigration policies, partly out of shame. During the war, many nations, including the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, had imposed severe restrictions on the immigration of European Jews. Shiploads of refugees were returned to the continent, where their passengers ended up in extermination camps. The shock of the camp's liberation forced these countries to reconsider their approach and in some cases to accept thousands of survivors, but the impact was not uniform. In some sectors of society, especially in Eastern Europe, the discovery of the camps did not substantially change anti-Semitic attitudes. In cities like Krakow and Kielce, Jews returning after the war encountered hostility, mistrust, and even violence. Anti-Semitism persisted, now disguised as social resentment or fear of revenge. Survivors were not always seen as victims, but as outsiders returning to reclaim what others had already appropriated. Despite this, the discovery of the camps had a profound catalytic effect. The scale of the crime forced Allied societies to adopt a new historical consciousness. It was necessary to create mechanisms of memory, establish days of commemoration, and ensure that future generations knew what had happened. In this climate of urgency, for example, the concept of never again was born, which became an international ethical motto. Documentaries produced in the early post-war years, such as Alan Ronay's celebrated Night and Fog, or the footage of the US military at Dachau, help establish a visual narrative of the Holocaust. These works not only informed, but confronted. They showed the naked face of evil, and they did so with a clear intention to ensure that no one could say they didn't know. The impact of the discovery of the camps was not limited to the moment of liberation. It was the beginning of a long process of mourning, reflection, and moral reconstruction. The Allied powers, having defeated Nazism on the battlefield, then understood that they must also confront it on the terrain of historical consciousness. The Seek and Prison, what happened to the prisoners and refugee camps set up by the Allies. But the liberation was not a happy ending for the survivors. There was no celebration. The moment the barbed wire fences opened did not necessarily mean the beginning of a new life. In many cases, it was the start of a new struggle, the fight for survival, against abandonment, and to find a place in a world they no longer recognized. Many of those liberated were so weak they could not even move. They had gone months, sometimes years, without adequate food, without access to basic hygiene, suffering from diseases such as typhus, dysentery, or tuberculosis. The sanitary conditions were catastrophic. In camps like Bergen-Belsen, bodies piled up unburied, and infectious disease spread unchecked. Allied medical units were quickly overwhelmed. In the first weeks after the liberation of some camps, hundreds, even thousands of prisoners died, not at Nazi hands, but from the irreversible after effects of accumulated suffering. The immediate priority was medical care. Field hospitals were set up next to the liberated camps. In places like Bergen, Belsen, and Buchenwald, the British and American armies began within hours distributing food, blankets, and basic supplies. But the hunger that had accumulated for months could not be resolved with the hot ration. Extreme malnutrition had destroyed the digestive systems of many prisoners. Feeding them ordinary food caused fatal diarrhea, intestinal collapse, or sudden death. So the recovery process was a painful learning process, and the Hippocratic Oath had to be enforced since trying to Savasomnione could inadvertently kill them. Military doctors, Red Cross nurses, medical personnel, and local volunteers did what they could. Some of the camps were immediately transformed into makeshift medical centers. Showers, once a symbol of extermination, were now used to wash lice-infested bodies with clean water. Heads were shaved to eliminate terrorists, and vaccinations were administered to prevent outbreaks of typhus, cholera, or tuberculosis. Many prisoners died in the days following liberation, not at Nazi hands, but from the irreversible accumulation of previous suffering. But not all survivors were ill. Some, though weak, remained lucid. They wanted to know what had happened to their families. They wanted to return to their homes. And above all, they wanted answers and justice. However, the reality that awaited them was far more complex than they imagined. As the camps emptied of corpses, the Allies quickly realized that they could not simply release all the prisoners and expect everyone to resume their previous lives. Most of them had no home to return to. Many villages had been destroyed. Other cities, such as Warsaw and Minsk, no longer existed in the form they had known. What's more, many of the survivors were orphans, the only members of their families still alive. Faced with this situation, a practical but crucial decision was made to establish Displaced Persons camps, or DP camps. These were not concentration camps, but shelters organized by the Allies, administered by the United Nations, which had been operating since 1943 through its predecessor organization, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Under this initiative, more than 700 displaced persons camps were established throughout devastated Europe, especially in Germany, Austria, and Italy. They housed not only Jews, but millions of people who had been uprooted from their homes during the war, including political prisoners, slave laborers, Soviet veterans, Roma Polish civilians, and survivors of multiple nationalities. However, the Jews who arrived at the displaced persons camps faced a unique situation. They were not simply displaced persons, but victims of an attempted systematic extermination. They did not want to return to the countries where they had been betrayed by neighbors, deported by collaborationist Verteidigungsverteidigungen, or ignored by entire communities. Returning home for them wasn't a safe option. Many Jewish survivors openly expressed their desire to immigrate, especially to Palestine. But in the meantime, the DP camps evolved into small communities, sometimes improvised, sometimes organized with remarkable efficiency. There, for the first time in years, survivors could sleep without fear. Community kitchens, Hebrew classes, religious services, collective funerals, schools for children, and even theater performance were organized. The cultural rebirth was remarkable. Surviving the Holocaust didn't just mean continuing to breathe. It meant rebuilding a devastated identity. In some camps, such as Fahrenwald, authentic Jewish communal life developed. Newspapers were printed in Yiddish. An internal administration was organized, and even self-defense structures emerged. Survivors began to write their testimonies, often urgently. before the horror was lost in oblivion. The first Zionist initiatives also appeared, with young people receiving physical and agricultural training to immigrate to Palestine. The administration of the camps was the joint responsibility of the Allies and humanitarianization. UNRWA, the Red Cross, the Joint Distribution Committee, the Jewish Agency for Palestine, and other institutions worked day and night to supply the camps, process paperwork, assist with family reunification, and prepare survivors for their next step. Some hoped to go to the United States, others to Canada, Australia, or South America. But bureaucratic hurdles, immigration quotas, and government slowness made the wait interminable. Despite their essential function, the displaced persons camps also faced criticism. There were shortages of resources, overcrowding, ethnic tensions between groups, and a permanent sense of limbo. Some survivors had lived 5 or 6 years in Nazi camps and were now forced to remain for additional years in new camps, this time without barbed wire, but also without complete freedom. The situation became so critical that in 1945, President Truman sent a commission headed by Earl Harrison to investigate the conditions of the Jews in the camps. The Harrison report, published that Samire, was damning. It declared that for those Jews, the horror of the concentration camps was over, but the nightmare continued. It pointed out the lack of differential treatment of Holocaust survivors and demanded immediate solutions. Following that report, conditions improved, resettlement processes were accelerated, and a change in immigration policy was initiated in some countries. In parallel, the Allied authorities began the process of denazification of Germany. Many of the former concentration camps were used to house Nazi prisoners of war or collaborators. Others were transformed into memorial sites. Some, however, were simply abandoned. But the priority remained humanitarian, caring for the living, restoring their dignity, and offering them a way out. During this period, between 1945 and 1948, approximately 250,000 Jews lived in displaced persons camps. It was in many ways a forgotten chapter of the post-war era. But during those years, the reconstruction of entire communities, the revival of the Brew language, and the emergence of a new collective consciousness took place. Amid the ruins of Europe, the survivors began to write their own future. Europe, no man's land. The reaction against Jewswo tried to return to their expropriated homes. For many Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, the immediate desire after liberation was none other than to return home. To return to their city, their village, or their neighborhood. To walk back through the door of the home they had been forced to abandon under threat of deportation and regain some of the normalcy that had been stolen. However, this return journey in thousands of cases did not lead to hope, but to a second trauma, as the homes they had left behind no longer existed, or worse still, they existed but were occupied by other tenants. Expropriated during the war, many Jewish properties had been handed over to neighbors, collaborationist officials, settlers brought in by the Nazi regime, or simply opportunists. In Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Romania, France, and even Germany, millions of houses, apartments, businesses, warehouses, and land passed into foreign hands with absolute impunity. When survivors returned, they were often greeted, not with compassion, but with hostility. They were seen as intruders, as a threat to the new local order, regardless of whether they were rightful owners of the properties. In many villages, their properties had already been sold or divided by the liberation authorities during the war, and their current occupants were unwilling to return anything. Attempts to reclaim homes or personal belongings generated intense tensions. Some local authorities refused to register the claims, and others simply ignored them. The survivors, physically and emotionally exhausted, were subjected to bureaucratic labyrinths that almost always ended in nothing. But beyond the administrative obstacle, the most brutal aspect was the social rejection. Anti-Semitism had not disappeared with fall of the Third Reich. It remained latent, rooted in years of propaganda, prejudice, and material expediency. For many Europeans, the elimination of the Jews had also meant an opportunity to appropriate homes, furniture, jewelry, works of art, businesses, and shops. The possibility that they would now return to claim what was theirs aroused fear, resentment, and even violence. One of the most symbolic cases of this violence was the Kilcha pogrom, which occurred in Poland on July 4, 1946. In this city, an unfounded rumor about the alleged ritual kidnapping of a Christian child by Jews spread rapidly. The result was an angry mob that attacked the Jewish community headquarters. Within hours, 42 Jews were brutally murdered. Dozens more were wounded. Many were survivors recently returned from the camps. The Kilcha pogrom was an unequivocal sign demonstrating that even after the Holocaust, despite the horrific death toll of 6 million, anti-Semitism remained a real threat. For many Jews, this event was the breaking point. They understood that Europe would no longer be a safe home, that it was not a place to which they could safely return. Hundreds of thousands of Jews considered that the continent where they had lived for generations had become hostile territory. In Eastern Europe, especially Poland, other similar episodes were recorded. Between 1945 and 1946, more than 350 violent incidents against returning Jews were recorded. Many of these incidents went unrecorded, and others were buried in the memory of fear. As a result, more than 100,000 Jews left Poland just a year after the end of the war. Elsewhere on the continent, the picture was not much different. In Hungary, for example, the economic situation was disastrous. The return of thousands of Jews caused friction with nationalist groups and with the new owners of expropriated property. In Slovakia, the communist authority blocked the return of property. In France, the restitution process was slow, complex, and bureaucratically stifling. In Germany, thousands of homes occupied by ordinary Germans prevented survivors from even accessing their former streets. Furthermore, it wasn't just about property. Many Jews tried to reconnect with family, reconnect with neighbors, or simply ask about friends. But in many cases, they encountered silence, evasion, and coldness. Civilian collaboration with the Nazi regime had been more extensive than they were willing to admit. And with that, silent guilt transformed into indifference or aggression. Adding to this rejection was the widespread poverty of the continent. Europe in 1945 lay in ruins. Millions of displaced people bombed cities, collapsed political systems. In this chaos, Holocaust survivors were not seen as victims, but as another burden, sometimes even as competitors for scarce resources such as housing, food, or decent jobs. Some official initiatives attempted to address the issue of property restitution. In countries such as France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, restitution commissions were created that allowed for the recovery of some properties, especially works of art, businesses, or bank accounts. But the process was uneven, slow, and often symbolic rather than real. In Eastern Europe, under Soviet rule, the very concept of private property had been abolished. Claims were in practice impossible. Faced with this situation, thousands of Jews gave up trying to recover what they had lost. They left their hometowns and headed to displaced persons camps, where transit communities began to form on their way to a new destination. Palestine, the United States, Argentina, Canada, or Australia became possible horizons. Any place that offered them security and a minimal chance of rebuilding a life. Paradoxically, the Holocaust not only destroyed entire Jewish communities, but also rendered the relationship between Jews and much of the European continent irreparable. Return was impossible, not due to a lack of will, but due to a lack of acceptance. Survivors understood that post-1945 Europe did not receive them as citizens, but as ghosts of the past that many preferred to forget. The trauma of the thwarted return was etched in the collective memory of the survivors. It was not only the loss of loved ones, but also the certainty that the places where they were born had turned their backs on them. The streets they knew, the languages they spoke, the cultures they shared, no longer belonged to them. Europe, their home for centuries, was no longer theirs. The promised land, the attempt of some surviving Jews to seek refuge in Palestine. After Europe showed signs of rejecting Holocaust survivors, Palestine became a beacon of hope for thousands of Jews who had managed to escape the camps. For many, it was not only a land of biblical promise, but the last real chance to live without fear, persecution, or rejection. Europe had failed them. America seemed distant with limited immigration quotas. However, Palestine under British mandate appeared to be the natural destination for Jewish rebirth. But that hope quickly clashed with the political reality of the time. Since 1920, Palestine had been administered by the United Kingdom, and the British Mandate, established by the League of Nations, recognized the right of the Jewish people to establish a national home in the region, as stipulated in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. However, it was also required to protect the civil rights of the Arab population, the majority in the territory. During the 1920s and 1932, increased Jewish immigration, especially from Eastern Europe and Nazi Germany, had generated growing tension with the Palestinian Arab population. Riots, and uprisings culminated in the Great Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939. As a result, the British government adopted a restrictive stance. In 1939, it issued the so-called White Paper, which severely limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to just 75,000 people over 5 years. A paltry number compared to the millions of refugees generated by the war and the Holocaust. After the end of the war in 1945, Holocaust survivors in displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy began organizing to try to reach Palestine. These were not just isolated individuals. Organized movements emerged, such as the WWII, which means escape in Hebrew, a clandestine network made up of Jewish ex-combatants, members of the resistance, and Zionist activists, which facilitated the transfer of refugees to Mediterranean ports. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 250,000 Jews attempted to immigrate illegally to Palestine. They did so on rickety, overloaded boats, often without flags and with falsified documents. This clandestine migration became known as Aliyah Bet, or the second immigration, in contrast to legal immigration. The British, however, maintained tight naval control. Many of these ships were intercepted and diverted to Cyprus, where the passengers were confined in detention camps. One of the most notorious cases was that of the ship Exodus, 1947, with 4515 Holocaust survivors on board. The Exodus departed the French port of Sète in July 1947, bound for Palestine. Upon reaching the coast, it was violently boarded by British troops. The confrontation left 3 dead and dozens injured. The passengers were taken to ports in France, where they refused to disembark, and were eventually returned to Germany. The image of Jews liberated from the concentration camps being sent back to German soil generated an internationalist and a wave of condemnation of British policy. In parallel, the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, intensified its pressure to allow the refugees to enter. Armed groups such as Haganah, the Irgun, and Lay not only collaborated with clandestine immigration, but also carried out armed operations against British targets, seeking to force a change in policy. Tensions escalated with attacks, sabotage, and spectacular actions such as the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946. The British government, weakened by the costs of the post-war period and unable to contain the conflict in Palestine, decided to bring the issue to the United Nations. In 1947, the unproposed partition plan, which divided Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under internationalization. Jewish leaders accepted the plan with reservations. Arab leaders rejected it outright. Meanwhile, the refugees continued to arrive. Many of those detained in Cyprus waited months, even years, for a visa. In Europe's displaced persons camps, frustration grew. The only light at the end of the tunnel remained Palestine. Some managed to arrive secretly, merging with the desert farming communities, or integrating into kibbutzim. For Holocaust survivors, the attempt to reach Palestine was more than a physical journey. It was an affirmation of life and a form of resistance. It was a conscious decision to rebuild the Jewish world on new foundations, from humiliation, hatred, and exile. Many saw Palestine not only as a promised land, but a land, one with blood, with suffering, with dignity. The effort to reach Palestine was also marked by a profound sense of community. It wasn't just about saving oneself. It was the impulse to found something new, to turn pain into strength. The stories of the survivors who managed to settle there speak of exhausting work, of hardship, but also of solidarity, a sense of purpose, and the rebuilding of broken identities. Finally, on May 14, 1948, following the withdrawal of the British authorities, the State of Israel was proclaimed. For hundreds of thousands of survivors waiting in Cyprus, in the camps of Europe, or already living in Jewish settlements in Palestine, that day marked the end of a journey and the beginning of a new story. Israel, born out of catastrophe, would be not only a refuge, but a new homeland. Returning home, the political formation of the State of Israel and the survivors' new home. On May 14, 1948 in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Zionist movement and president of the Jewish National Council, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. That moment marked the culmination of decades of Zionist aspiration, the climax of a history of persecution, migration, and resistance. For Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, it was much more than a political proclamation. It was the vindication of a people who, having been condemned to extinction, nor claimed their inalienable right to exist, to govern themselves, and to defend themselves. The creation of the State of Israel was the result of multiple forces that converged at the end of World War II. Political Zionism, which began in the late 19th century, had posited the need to establish a national home for the Jewish people in response to European anti-Semitism. The tragedy of the Holocaust gave this ideal an irrefutable urgency. Entire nations had proven unable to protect their Jewish citizens. Only a state of their own seemed to guarantee their security and future. In 1947, after years of conflict between Jews, Arabs, and British authorities in Palestine, the United Kingdom renounced its continued mandate over the territory. The issue was referred to the United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181, known as the Partition Plan, which proposed dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. The Jewish community accepted the proposal. The Arab community, both inside and outside of Palestine, rejected it. The Declaration of Independence, made effective one day before the official British withdrawal, immediately provoked a violent response. 5 Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, unhesitatingly declared war on the not-state of Israel. Thus began the First Arab-Israeli War, also known as the War of Independence to Israelis and the Nakba or catastrophe to Palestinians. Holocaust survivors, many of whom had barely arrived on Israeli soil, participated directly in the conflict. Some were recruited as soldiers, others helped build fortifications, farm for supplies to the front, or perform logistical tasks. Despite their physical weakness, the still fresh trauma and language barriers, thousands joined the war effort as a continuation of their struggle for life. During the war, the fledgling State of Israel managed to expand its territorial control beyond the scope of the UN partition. The military victory came at a high human price. Hundreds of Palestinian villages were evacuated, destroyed, or absorbed, and more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled. This mass exodus generated a refugee conflict that remains unresolved to this day. For Jews, however, Israel's independence meant a national rebirth. The state offered immediate citizenship to any Jew who arrived on its territory. This policy, known as the Law of Return, enacted in 1950, granted refuge to hundreds of thousands of Jews displaced by the war and the pilgrims still active in Eastern Europe. Between 1948 and 1951, more than 700,000 Jews immigrated to Israel. A significant proportion of them were Holocaust survivors from Poland, Hungary, Germany, Romania, and the displaced persons camps in Austria and Italy. This mass immigration posed enormous challenges for a country that was barely emerging. Cities were filled with tents, barracks, and makeshift settlements. The state had to improvise systems for food distribution, housing, and work. Social integration was slow and not without friction. Holocaust survivors scarred by years of hunger, loss, and humiliation arrived in a young, dynamic, and militarized society that idealized the new Jew. The image of a strong, courageous farmer, capable of meeting his own needs and contributing to the state. The newcomers, on the other hand, were perceived by some as passive or broken by the tragedy. Mutual understanding was not easy. The trauma of the Holocaust was also not addressed in depth in the early years of the state. Many survivors remained silent out of shame, pain, or incomprehension. The wounds were invisible, and the dominant narrative preferred to focus on resilience and collective heroism. It was only in the 1960s, with the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, that the narrative of the Holocaust began to occupy a central place in Israeli identity. The voices of survivors then found a legitimate space to be heard and respected. Meanwhile, Israel became a laboratory for national reconstruction. Kibbutzim, agricultural cooperatives, fledgling industries, hospitals, and schools flourished. A vibrant heterogeneous society was built on the devastation with elements from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and the global diaspora. Holocaust survivors, despite the difficulties, integrated and actively contributed to that construction. Many of them were involved in education, art, medicine, research, and politics. Some founded museums such as Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Documentation and Commemoration Center in Jerusalem, established in 1953. Others told their stories in books, filmed testimonies, or in classrooms. The Ursulant presence slowly transformed into collective memory, and thus, Israel became the primary refuge for persecuted Jews around the world. It welcomed not only Holocaust survivors, but also entire communities of Jews expelled from the Arab world, Ethiopia, and the Soviet Union decades later. The very existence of the state represented an act of historical reparation, a political response to anti-Semitism, and a symbol of continuity. Despite constant conflicts with its neighbors, wars, attacks, and existential threats, Israel established itself as a central player on the international stage. For many Holocaust survivors, living in a country with its own army, embassies, and a restored Hebrew language was an experience unthinkable a few years earlier, when their fates were in the hands of anonymous executioners. The founding of State of Israel did not resolve all the problems of the Jewish people, nor did it completely heal the wounds of the Holocaust. But it did provide something essential, the possibility of living with dignity under its own laws, with a voice and memory. For those who survived the Nazi hell, Israel represented an encore, an end to exile and silence. Recovering Nazi loot, historical reparation, and attempts to recover expropriated property, artwork, and land. As World War II faded, the world was faced with the daunting task of dealing not only with the immeasurable number of lives lost, but also with the vast amount of property, businesses, land, artwork, and personal belongings systematically stolen or expropriated from European Jewry. The Holocaust was not only a human massacre, but also an economic plunder orchestrated by the Nazi state, its allies, and in many cases by ordinary citizens who appropriated the belongings of their Jewish neighbors. Historical reparation was a slow, complex, and in many cases incomplete process. The first attempts at compensation took place in a context where priorities were different. Their construction of Europe, the establishment of new borders, and the care of millions of displaced persons. For the Jewish survivors, who often had no papers, no witnesses, and not even a home to return to, the fight for restitution was a daunting task. In 1952, just 4 years after the founding of State of Israel, one of the most significant agreements in this field was signed. The Luxembourg Agreement between West Germany and Israel established that the Federal Republic of Germany recognized its moral and legal responsibility for the crimes of Nazism and committed to making reparation plans. This agreement was hotly debated both within Israel and in the diaspora. For many, accepting money from Germany was unacceptable. For others, it was a pragmatic act necessary to rebuild broken lives in a state still in its infancy. Through this pact, Germany pledged to pay an initial sum of 3 billion German marks to the State of Israel and another 450 million to the Claims Conference. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, an organization that would act on behalf of stateless Jews or those without direct heirs. This agreement marked the beginning of a long series of individual, collective, and symbolic compensation that continued in the following decades. The individual restitution process was particularly painful. Survivors had to prove their identity, their losses, and their status as victims. Many had no documents, witnesses, or legal recourse. So, some were rejected immediately, while others waited decades. Compensation payments arrived late, sometimes after the recipients had already died or were in extremely vulnerable conditions. Despite the difficulties, millions of people managed to receive some form of financial compensation. Even more complex was the restitution of physical property, such as homes, businesses, or land. In many cases, the assets had been taken over by other families, sold, or destroyed. Some Eastern European states under communist regimes nationalized everything the Nazis had expropriated and rejected any claims. It was only after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet bloc that certain cases began to be reopened. But not all progress was made. Bureaucracy, a lack of political will, and the passage of time were powerful obstacles. In parallel, another dimension of looting emerged: the appropriation of cultural property. During the Nazi occupation, hundreds of thousands of works of art, books, manuscripts, musical instruments, and private collections were confiscated. Some of this loot was gathered by high-ranking Nazi officials such as Hermann Göring, as well as museums, universities, and private collectors. The economic Aryanization also included entire libraries and archives. After the war, thousands of works were found by the Allied armies. Teams such as the Monuments Men charged with locating, identifying, and returning these pieces. However, many objects never returned to their original owners. Some disappeared, while others were handed over to the wrong governments. Although it is believed that most remain stored in European museums without clear labeling or provenance research. Beginning in the 1990s, and especially following the 1998 Washington Conference on Holocaust Assets, the world began to take this outstanding debt more seriously. At this conference, 44 countries signed non-binding principles to facilitate restitution or compensation for stolen works of art. These principles encouraged museums to review their collections and make public catalogs of works of dubious provenance. Numerous restitution processes accelerated from that point on. Paintings by Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, Pablo Picasso, and Marc Chagall were returned to Jewish heirs, in some cases after decades of litigation. However, many museums still hold works whose provenance is disputed, and not all states have been equally transparent in their cooperation. In some countries, governments have established specific laws to address these claims. Austria, for example, created a restitution commission and returned important collections. France reviewed the repositories of the Louvre Museum and other cultural centers. Germany, for its part, promoted programs to investigate the origin of works acquired during the Third Reich, but the pace and political will have been uneven. In several cases, claims have been held back by legal technicalities or a lack of consensus. Beyond the material, historical reparation also included symbolic gestures. Monuments, official apologies, days of commemoration, and educational programs were part of a broader effort to acknowledge the harm caused. Germany especially adopted a policy of active memory. Its chancellery, parliament, and cultural institutions assumed historical responsibility for Nazi crimes as part of its democratic identity. Not all countries followed this example. Some chose silence, oblivion, or minimization. Others, such as Poland and Hungary, faced controversy over their restitution laws or over narratives that downplay local complicity in the crimes. Holocaust memory remains in many parts of Europe a field of ideological, political, and legal dispute. At the same time as all this was happening, the heirs of the victims continued to litigate, sometimes from the United States, sometimes from Israel or Europe. Swiss banks, insurance companies like Allianz, and industrial companies like Volkswagen and IG Farben were the subject of class action lawsuits. In some cases, multi-million-dollar settlements were achieved that benefited survivors and their families. But in others, the legal battles are still ongoing. Reparation, however, cannot be measured solely in economic terms. For many survivors, the value of recovering a ring, a photograph, a family painting, or the title to a lost property had a deeply emotional meaning. It was a way to restore dignity, to reconstruct the broken thread of a life that barbarity had attempted to erase. And at the same time, it was a warning. May the crime not go unpunished. May the dispossession not be normalized. May history not repeat itself. More than 80 years after the Holocaust, the process of reparation continues. Every archive opened, every object returned to its owners, every truth acknowledged, constitutes a small act of justice. It is a struggle against oblivion and a reminder that the suffering of millions cannot be easily archived or settled. Architecture of remembrance. The enormous task of building spaces and monuments dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust. After the devastation of the Holocaust, when the extermination camps were liberated, and survivors began to recount the horror they had experienced, an urgent but complex need arose. The obligation to remember the terribilities committed by the Nazis. It was a matter of commemorating the irreparable, naming the millions who could no longer speak, and little by little, reconstructing not only Jewish life, but also the collective memory of what Dachau had been. This titanic task was taken on by the survivors themselves, by Jewish communities around the world, by researchers, activists, governments, and subsequent generations. In the early post-war years, mourning was silent. Many survivors didn't speak as the trauma was too profound. Some felt shame and others simply guilt. In host countries such as the United States, Argentina, Israel, and Canada, the story of the Holocaust was not central. Integration and reconstruction were prioritized at the cost of forgetting. But over time, the need to tell stories and not let the world forget took over. Silence gave way to words. Words gave way to institutionalized memory. One of the first places where this memory was physically captured was in Israel. There in 1953, the government founded Yad Vashem. Vashem, the official state institution for the memory of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. More than a museum, Yad Vashem is a vast complex of archives, memorials, gardens, and documentation spaces. Its mission goes beyond remembrance. It researches, collects testimonies, educates, recognizes the righteous among the nations, those non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the war, and actively works to preserve the identity of each victim, recovering their names, faces, and stories. Yad Vashem became the global epicenter of Holocaust remembrance, but it wasn't the only one. Over the years, museums, centers, and monuments have sprung up on every continent. In the United States, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, opened in 1993, Washington, D.C., has established itself as a key institution for Holocaust education and documentation. Its permanent exhibitions, archives, educational role and research have made it an international reference. In Europe, former concentration and extermination camps have often been transformed into memorial sites. Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Maiden, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau have all been preserved as material witnesses to the horror. Thousands of people visit them each year, not as tourist attractions, but as pilgrimages of conscience. There, the silence and the starkness of the remains, the sinister gas chambers, the barbed wire fences, the crematoria, and the accumulated belongings confront humanity with its own capacity for destruction. In addition to these historic sites, Europe erected monuments in its major capitals. In Berlin, the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, designed by Peter Eisenman and inaugurated in 2005, occupies an entire city block near the Brandenburg Gate. Its concrete blocks arranged on undulating terrain invite an experience of disorientation and contemplation. Underground, a documentation center recounts the tragedy with names, dates, and personal accounts. Plaques, sculptures, and memorials have also been erected in Paris, Amsterdam, Vienna, Budapest, Warsaw, and Prague, among other cities. There are even community initiatives such as Stolperstein or stumbling blocks, small golden paving stones placed in front of the houses where victims of Nazism lived, bearing their names and dates of deportation or murder. This minimal gesture, pioneered by German artist Gott Demnig, has spread to dozens of countries, turning sidewalks into silent maps of genocide. Institutional memory also took shape through organizations. The Claims Conference, established in 1951, not only negotiated reparations with Germany, but also funded educational and survivor assistance programs. The World Jewish Congress and the European Jewish Congress have been key in promoting Holocaust remembrance in international organizations. Organizations such as AMCA in Israel offered psychological support to survivors and continue to do so with their descendants. The transmission of memory also became an intergenerational responsibility. The children and grandchildren of survivors, the second and third generations, took up the fight for remembrance. In many cases, they founded associations, published testimonies, made films, and organized marches. Remembrance ceased to be an individual burden and became a collective task. One of the most important rituals in this process is Yom Kippur. Hashawa, Holocaust Remembrance Day, is commemorated annually in Israel and in many Jewish communities around the world. During this day, candles are lit, names are read, and minutes of silence are observed. In Israel, a national siren interrupts the daily routine for 2 minutes. Everything stops, from traffic to walks to shops. During those 2 minutes, the entire nation commits itself to the act of remembrance. Education has become another essential pillar. In many countries, Holocaust studies have been incorporated into school programs. Museum visits, meetings with survivors, literary contests, and reflection sessions are organized. Many teachers receive training in memory education, emphasizing respect for human rights and combating anti-Semitism. Despite these efforts, the challenge of preserving memory remains. Witnesses are passing away, and the last generation of survivors is entering their final years. With them, the first-hand experience, the direct account, is also fading. As a result, initiatives have been launched to record their testimonies, digitize them, and safeguard them for future generations. Projects such as the Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg, have gathered tens of thousands of interviews in dozens of languages, creating an unprecedented audiovisual archive. The memory of the Holocaust also faces threats such as trivialization, denial, historical revisionism, and the resurgence of anti-Semitism. In some contexts, history is rewritten, minimized, or exploited for political purposes. Therefore, memorial sites are not merely tributes to the past, they are also battlegrounds of the present. They serve as warnings, reminders of how far hatred can go when normalized or left unchallenged. The Holocaust was a pivotal moment for humanity. The memory of this catastrophe belongs not only to the Jewish people, it is a universal legacy. That is why, in 2005, the United Nations General Assembly designated January 27th, the day Auschwitz was liberated, as the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. Every year, representatives from around the world gather in New York, Paris, Jerusalem, and numerous other cities to remember and renew their commitment to truth, justice, and human dignity. Memorial spaces, Jewish organizations, books, testimonies, ceremonies, and monuments cannot erase the pain, but they prevent it from being denied. In a world where forgetting is a constant temptation, remembering becomes an act of resistance. Every name spoken, every story recounted, every flower laid before a wall reaffirms a fundamental truth: life has value, and memory preserves it.